Forbidden clothes, Jamila Gavin. They are taking her away from us. Mrs. Khan articulated her words in a flat, monotone voice, but as she spoke, she leaned forward and stared intensely into the eyes of her volunteer English teacher, Margot Henderson. Margot stared back, momentarily shocked out of her boredom. This was the first English sentence Mrs. Khan had put together herself after nearly 6 weeks of learning. "What do you mean?" asked Margot. Still leaning forward, Mrs. Khan spoke again. She repeated the same sentence, hammering it out with staccato precision. "They are taking her away from us." "Who is taking who away from you?" asked Margot, looking round. Then she met the large, dark eyes of the 15-year-old girl in the school photograph. It sat alone on the mantelpiece, testifying to the reverence and devotion accorded to an only child. She wasn't beautiful. Her face had been left to fend for itself, framed only by a severe headscarf which swept her hair away out of sight. Her nose was too long and narrow, the cheekbones too angular, her mouth too broad. Yet there was something compelling about the way she looked almost defiantly into the camera, as if she was trying to say, "Yes, this is me. There's more to me than meets the eye." "Ah, yes, Nasreen," repeated Margot brightly. "How is she getting on at school?" Margot asked her question loudly and slowly, as if the woman were deaf. Mrs. Khan opened her mouth and drew in her breath sharply as she struggled to find the words. Not fine. "Fine." She shrugged helplessly and slumped back in her seat, drawing her veil across her face. Margot felt the irritation rising up in her. Mrs. Khan was not her favorite pupil. She was a slow learner, and she resented the sense of dumb depression which seemed to envelop the woman, slowing down her movements and imprinting an expression of wooden despair on her face. "Don't just say fine, Mrs. Khan. Put it in a sentence," urged Margot with exaggerated patience. "Nasreen is fine." "No!" exclaimed Mrs. Khan sharply. "Nasreen is no fine." She struggled desperately. "You mean Nasreen is not fine," corrected Margot. "Nasreen is not fine," repeated Mrs. Khan obediently. "Is something wrong at school?" asked Margot. She glanced at her watch and noted with relief that their time was up. Mrs. Khan saw the movement. She stood up, twisting the ends of her veil in her fingers. "Yes, it is time to go," said Margot thankfully. She was really not in the mood for trying to extricate sufficient English out of Mrs. Khan to find out what was bothering her. "If you have a problem with Nasreen, the best thing to do is to talk to the school," said Margot. "Perhaps your husband can. He speaks good English, doesn't he?" Then, giving her a kindly pat on the arm, she gathered up her textbook. "Try and work through the exercises we have covered today, okay? And I'll see you next week." Then she made her own way to the front door and opened it. "Goodbye, Mrs. Khan." Mrs. Khan didn't reply, but stood in the semi-darkness of the rear of the hall. She looked as if she were being swallowed up within her satin tunic and pajamas as she clutched the veil around herself. "Bye," repeated Margot, giving a cheery wave, and shut the front door behind her. "Nasreen! Nasreen, come on, we'll miss the bus." Louise Dibben danced impatiently at her friend's elbow as she stood in front of the long mirror, fluffing out her hair and squirting clouds of hair lacquer into it. "How do I look?" asked Nasreen, twisting her head to examine her profile. "You look great, really great. Now come on. If we miss the bus, it will be all for nothing." "Okay, I'm coming." She gave a last critical glance at herself. The transformation was pretty good. From her demure, sexless school uniform with headscarf and slacks for modesty, she had squeezed herself into a tight, elasticated pair of jeans for which she had secretly saved up for weeks to buy. They flattered her figure, she thought, emphasizing her long legs and narrow waist. "Does my bum look too big?" she asked, turning sideways. "You look great, I tell you," insisted Louise. "And I like your top and all," she added. "You got better boobs than me, lucky thing. But hurry up. We're all right for time," said Nasreen, glancing at her watch. "Stop panicking. We've got 5 minutes yet. I've got to do me eyes." Louise sighed and sat on her bed. "Gosh, if your mum and dad could see you now, they'd have a blooming fit." "My dad would kill me," murmured Nasreen as she brushed the mascara onto her eyelashes. Nasreen had taken to coming back to Louise's house most days after school. Gradually, she had built up a secret wardrobe of leggies and low-cut tops, of miniskirts and t-shirts, sometimes plain and sometimes with slogans blazoned across the chest. "My forbidden clothes," she would laugh. She felt like Cinderella transforming herself to go out and have a ball, then rushing back to change into her uniform, headscarf and dull slacks, so that when she went back home, she would once more be the demure, innocent little girl her parents thought she was. Nasreen still shuddered when she remembered the pain of those early days at Merton Close. She had never been made to feel different before, but now all people seemed to see were her differences: her different coloured skin, her different clothes, her different voice, and most of all, her different religion. She was nothing but a Parky until Louise decided to be her friend. Louise was brash. Louise was loud. Louise was a leader. People listened to her. She seemed so grown up. She was the first to perm her hair and wear tight short skirts. She was the first to have a boyfriend and sit smoking in the bus shelter with him. She had opinions and talked back to teachers. So Nasreen was astonished when one day Louise marched up to her with a maths book and said, "Hey Nasreen, you're good at maths. Help me with this." They began going to each other's houses, but Nasreen knew her mother didn't like Louise and thought she was a bad influence. So instead, she only went round to Louise's house. Nasreen loved the Dibben household. It was so different from her own clean, silent, scrupulously tidy house. Here it looked as if a tornado had struck it most of the time, always buried under a rubble of toys and washing, babies' bottles and half-chewed rusks. Yet it was a good-natured chaos, and no one minded if she and Louise slumped across the sofa watching television and munching sandwiches. "Want to go with me to the disco?" Louise asked her one day. "Oh, no, I couldn't." Nasreen looked shocked at the prospect, then disappointed, because she wished she could go. "I'd never be allowed," she said sadly. "Don't tell him then," snapped Louise, bold as brass. "Anyway, I've got no clothes," added Nasreen. "I couldn't go like this." "Borrow mine," retorted Louise. Then she shrieked excitedly, "Hey, let me dress you up. Please, Nasreen, just for fun." So that's how it all started. There, okay? She turned round to show her friend her face with her painted eyelids, stiff blackened lashes, the hint of blusher on her cheeks, and just the right shade of lipstick to tone in. "Beautiful!" exclaimed Louise generously. "Now, let's go." The two girls clattered downstairs. An admiring whistle rang out from the kitchen. Louise's younger brother, Craig, gave a cheeky wave. "Like your jeans, Nasreen. Sexy." "Oh, shut up," squealed Nasreen, but she was pleased. Sitting at the back of the bus, Nasreen and Louise admired each other and laughed at the world they had set out to conquer. In 10 minutes they had alighted in the centre of town and made their way along to the precinct where they knew all their friends would be congregating. "Carl's there," Louise hissed at her friend. "So?" exclaimed Nasreen, flushing. "You know you want to get off with him and he's just split up with Denise." "Has he?" cried Nasreen. "Why didn't you tell me before? Oh gosh, how do I look?" "I've told you, you look fabulous. If he doesn't fall for you, he's a blind dope." "Oh, good, there's Mark," Louise squealed and ran over to join her boyfriend. The telephone rang. "It's me." "Where are you?" wailed Mrs. Khan. "Why weren't you on the bus?" "Mum, I went to Louise's house. We're doing our homework together. She's miles better at geography than me and she's helping me," explained Nasreen convincingly. "But what about tea?" asked Mrs. Khan. "I've got yours already here." "Sorry, Mum," said Nasreen. "Louise's mum gave me some, so I'm fine. Must go. We've got tons to get done." "When will you be home?" asked Mrs. Khan quickly, trying to hang on to her daughter's voice. "Well," Nasreen answered vaguely, "I think we've got another hour or two's work, because after geography I said I'd help Louise with her maths. I'm better at that than her." Mrs. Khan hesitated, trying desperately to assert her authority. "Get back before your dad does, won't you?" "Of course I will, Mum. Must go. Bye." And the phone went dead. "Okay?" asked Carl as she came out of the phone booth. "Yeah," Nasreen smiled sweetly at him and slipped her arm in his. "Have we got time to go to the Flamingo? Have a quick drink?" asked Carl. "Louise and Mark have gone on ahead." "Of course," cried Nasreen happily. "But I've got to be changed, and on that 8 o'clock bus home, me dad gets in at 9, and I've got to make it before he does, or else there'll be hell to pay." Mrs. Khan stood in the bay window. Although darkness had fallen, she hadn't put on the light, but had drawn aside the net curtains to gaze invisibly up and down the empty street outside. A hard lump of anxiety pressed into her chest so that it hurt to breathe. She was afraid. But then she realized she had always been afraid. Ever since Nasreen had moved up into secondary school, things had changed. They used to walk together, side by side, friends. But then Nasreen took to going on ahead or dawdling behind her mother. Even the way she walked changed. Instead of the leisurely, shy walk, she now strode, long-legged, looking more and more like a Western girl despite her headscarf and the slack back under her school uniform. On approaching the school gates, she would suddenly see her friends and, tossing out the word goodbye, as if to no one in particular, she would disappear into the school, arms linked and immersed in the sound of gossip and laughter. She never looked back these days. That was when the lump of misery took residence in Mrs. Khan's heart. They are taking her away, taking her away. She hissed the words out in English as if someone would hear and understand her fears. She felt a sudden surge of anger as she remembered her English teacher. They? Who's they? Mrs. Khan could hear the indifferent voice as Margot Henderson asked the question. They? Why, the Dibbons, of course. Mrs. Khan answered it now to the empty room, spotlessly clean, neat and devoid of any signs of human activity, just as Mr. Khan liked to have it when he came home. The Dibbons. Mrs. Khan clasped her arms tightly around her body, straight-jacketing herself as if afraid if she did not she might scream at the world, I'm lonely, and they're taking my child away from me. Nasreen? Sound of the front door sent her scurrying to the hall. Nasreen tossed her school bag inside and kicked the front door closed. Hi, Mum, she said indifferently, and didn't look her in the eye. Sorry I'm late. We had tons of homework. I'm going to my room. I'm tired and I just want to flop. Nasreen? Mrs. Khan reached out and touched her daughter's cheek. She wanted to clasp her, reclaim her. Did you have supper? She asked. I made your favorite pakoras. Come to the kitchen and have some. No, Mum, Nasreen refused impatiently. I'm not hungry. I had plenty to eat at Louise's. Just let me go to my room. She shook herself free from her mother's grasp and rushed upstairs. Once in her room, she hastily removed the rest of her forbidden clothes. She carefully folded them into a carrier bag and tucked it right at the back of her wardrobe. Then she sat in front of her mirror. Had her mother noticed remnants of her makeup? She leaned forward to scrutinize herself and looked into her own eyes. They were shining with excitement. Carl had seen her home. Carefully, of course, because it wouldn't do for any of the neighbors to see her, especially anyone from her own community. They had hidden in the bus shelter while she took off her jeans and put back her school slacks under her uniform. What about the headscarf? He asked, after she had shaken out her hair and replaited it. But she dropped her head with embarrassment. Oh, that doesn't matter, she said. Of course it did. And when he said goodbye to her at the corner, he kissed her till she felt she would faint and hurriedly walked away. She tied on her headscarf when he was out of sight and went home slowly, giving time for her flushed cheeks to calm down. Now, as she stared at her reflection, she felt guilty. She didn't like feeling guilty. It made her angry. She didn't want to think about the shock and disappointment her father would feel if he knew what she was doing. She didn't want to think of how she was hurting her mother. At the moment, it was her mother above all who made her angry. She was so pliable, so pathetically vulnerable. Her whole life was devoted to serving her husband, serving her daughter. Nothing she did was for her own benefit. She allowed herself to be a victim. I won't be like that. I won't, Nasreen swore to herself. Suddenly, Nasreen heard the front door. She heard her mother's puzzled footsteps hurry into the hall. Nasreen! Nasreen! It was her father's voice, rough with anger. Nasreen's up in her room, she heard her mother say nervously. You back early? Is everything all right? He ignored her and called again. Nasreen, get down here. I wish to speak to you. Fiercely, he switched on all the lights. Nasreen slowly descended the stairs, pausing halfway down, her pale face looming over the banister. Hi, Dad. She tried to sound unconcerned. Get down here. He prodded his finger into the airspace before him. She continued her descent, meeting her mother's puzzled eyes at the bottom. Then she faced her father. Here. He prodded the air in front of him. Nasreen? Mrs. Khan touched her daughter's arm. She had never seen Mr. Khan look so angry. Mrs. Khan wanted to protect her. She clung to her arm, pulling her back. What is it, Rashid? What has she done? Please don't harm her. Let go of her. His voice was cold and determined. Nasreen has shamed me and her family and her community, and she must be made to realize what she has done. How? Cried Mrs. Khan. What has she done, Nasreen? She turned pitifully to her daughter. What have you done? She has been seen in the town without her veil and slacks, dressed like one of those loose English girls, wearing a tight miniskirt, high heels, and makeup like a prostitute. How dare you? How dare you do this to us? He began to remove his leather belt. No, Rashid, no, begged Mrs. Khan. I'm sure Nasreen won't do this again. Will you, Nasreen? And it's not the first time. Mr. Khan's voice choked with emotion. I now hear that this has been going on for months. months. Everyone in the community knows about it. Everyone has been talking about it behind our backs. You have ridiculed me." "Nasreen," she looked at her daughter for some sign of repentance, but to her amazement, Nasreen stood before her father, upright and unflinching as he raised his arm, moved round her, and brought the belt down across her back. "Why are you doing this, Nasreen?" the head of her school pleaded with her. "Why do you go on behaving in a way which upsets your mother and father and your whole community? All you get is a beating. Is it really worth it?" Usually, Nasreen took her beatings and demonstrations sullenly and without a word, but this time she looked up at her head teacher and said quietly, "Sir, I'll be 16 in 2 months' time. That's all the time I have left to be free. When I'm 16, they'll marry me off. I expect it'll be to some bloke from Pakistan who I've never met. I'm clever enough to go to university, aren't I? But I won't be allowed. I'll have to stay at home and have babies and be nothing but a good little housewife, sewing and ironing and having a meal ready in the evening. That's how it'll be when I'm 16. That's how it'll be for the rest of my life. Well, sir, I've got 2 months left, and I don't care how often I get beaten. I'm going to go into town and dress as I like and smoke in shop doorways, and my dad'll have to kill me before he stops me having what freedom is left." "Did you ever find out what that Mrs. Khan meant when she said they are taking her away from me?" asked the colleague. She and Margot Henderson had met again in the precinct coffee shop. "Funny you should ask," said Margot, putting down her coffee cup. "After I last saw you, I got a message to say that Mrs. Khan wanted to give up the lessons. Can't say I was disappointed. The last I heard was that the daughter, Nasreen, had run away and gone to live with her best friend." "What are you doing?" Louise woke and stared into the darkness. "It's the middle of the night. Are you ill?" She could just make out Nasreen standing in the center of the bedroom. "Nasreen!" She sat up in bed and switched on her table lamp. "What are you doing? Where are you going?" Nasreen was fully dressed, but in her tunic, pajamas, and veil. By her side was a suitcase. She picked it up and moved towards the bedroom door. "That's it for me now, Louise," she said quietly. "It's my birthday tomorrow." "Yeah, I know. Me and the gang, we've all got a smashing party organized for you," cried Louise. "Well, you'll have to have it without me," said Nasreen. "I'm going home. Don't try and stop me, please." She put out a resisting hand as Louise flung her legs out of bed and made to hold her back. "Just let me go. I know what I'm doing. I've had my fun, but it had to end. I made a pact with myself that when I'm 16 I return to my community. It's where I really belong. Don't make it hard for me, Louise, please. Thank you for everything you've done for me. Thank your parents too. I'll make it up to you one day, promise. Meantime, just let me go without any fuss." Then she slipped out of the door and was gone. It wasn't quite dawn, yet Mrs. Khan woke to see a rosy glow through the bedroom window. She had barely slept all night long, as she had barely slept since Nasreen left home. Now, with a dull curiosity, she slid out of bed without disturbing her sleeping husband and went to the window. "Rashid!" she called out uncontrollably. He awoke instantly, alerted by the urgency in her voice. He went to her side and looked out of the window. Nasreen had lit a bonfire. The flames shot upwards into the night sky. They could see her figure silhouetted against the firelight as from time to time she bent down and, taking a garment from the open suitcase, tossed it onto the fire. Sparks flew upwards, scattering like fireflies. When she had emptied the suitcase, she stood transfixed for a while, staring at the embers. Then, pulling her veil over her head and drawing it tightly round her shoulders, she turned towards the house. "Nasreen! Nasreen!" whispered her mother. "At last you have come back to us."